We have now come in this analysis about the key of David given to the Philadelphia era, or rather to Philadelphia remnant. We have come now to, brethren, each particular tribe. We need to delve into each particular tribe of Israel to see how the prophecies of Genesis and Deuteronomy that were uttered by Jacob and that were uttered by Moses in the Pentateuch are being fulfilled today among the descendants of Jacob. Also, of course, there are other prophecies from other prophets that are being fulfilled today, or had been fulfilled, or were fulfilled in the past, but they're just they have far-reaching effect. For example, the throne of David, as you know, it was prophesied it will take the root again and will continue to flourish. It was prophesied in both Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and also in the book of Isaiah. So we need to see how those prophecies are being fulfilled today. So we shall go into the first tribe. We'll just analyze the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah, of course, has a very rich history and a great influence, after all, even in modern day life. So therefore, no wonder we'll just have to make it into two parts, because I want you to kind of digest it, well, and to be able to digest what is there about the tribe of Judah. Now, of course, you realize that Judah lives in the state of Israel today. Plenty of Judah lives in New York. But it might come as a surprise to you that there are Judah and Judah influence in Northern Ireland and Scotland, believe it or not. Now we're going to see how and why. So in this first part, I just want to bring to your attention that for the sake of time, I will be just giving you the references in the Bible, mostly, rather than reading all the scriptures. But we do have notes, and you'll be able to go over those notes in English language, of course, and to analyze them. Thankfully, I've made all those notes also in Serbian, and I'll just turn it into a form of a book in Serbian, the book, because the truth about the identity of Israel and the role of Israel in God's salvation, plan of salvation, has never been preached in Serbian language, and I've already delivered audio messages about Israel in the prophecy in Serbian, and I also plan again to have this publication of a book which would encompass all of those things that we've been analyzing in the last how many weeks now. The basic lessons about the truth of Israel, also each particular tribe, how the prophecies are being fulfilled today, and then of course there will be the truth about the second Exodus, which you have learned and you remember from my sermon about the coming great second Exodus. Anyway, the tribe of Judah. Now Shem, S-H-E-M, Shem, one of the sons of Noah, was the father of the Semites. And one of his descendants was Eber, A-B-E-R. He was Shem's great-grandson, and he is recorded in Genesis 11, chapter 11, verses 11 through 14. Now, Shem's great-grandson Eber was the father of the Hebrews. They've got the name from him, Eber Hebrews. And from one of these Hebrews came Jacob, who, as you remember, was later called Israel in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, and from whom came the Israelites. Now, one of these Israelites, brethren, was named Judah, and Judah became the father of the Jews. Now, it is clear, therefore, that not all Semites, now this is very important, so mark this, brethren, not all Semites are Jews, and not all Hebrews are Jews. Not even all Israelites are Jews, but all Jews are Israelites and Hebrews and Semites. And most people just don't understand this clear distinction. Now, in fact, the first place in all the Bible where the word Jew appears, we find that the Jews were fighting Israelites. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 6, the first time when the kingdom was already rendered into two parts. Northern kingdom, the house of Judah, 10 tribes, and the house of Israel, that is 10 tribes, and then southern kingdom with the capital in Jerusalem, the house of Judah. That's the first time in 2 Kings 16:6 that we find the term Judah, and Judah was at war with Israel. Now, to identify where the Jews are today, we must first have a background. Now, Judah, it is written in Genesis 38, verses 1 through 5, Judah was first married to a racially impure wife, Shua, and he had 3 sons who were racially, we might say, impure. They were not all Semites, because Shua, the wife of Judah, was a Canaanite. It's written in Genesis 38 verses 1 through 5. Now the 3 sons of Judah were named Onan, and Shelach. And Onan died childless, and Shelach's descendants were workers in fine linen, potters, gardeners, and aides to the king. It is recorded about Shelach's descendants in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 21 through 23. Interestingly enough, none were bankers, so the stereotyped Jew with olive skin, dark complexion, snub nose, and curly black hair came in part from this branch of Judah, this racially mixed branch of Judah. Now, before discussion of Judah's other sons, it is important to understand the promise that God made to Abraham. It's mentioned, as you know, in Genesis 22 verse 18. God's promise to Abraham was that in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And that you have the reference points to that also in Genesis 13 verse 16 and Genesis 26 verses 3 and 4. Now this is known as the promise of grace to take away the sins of the world. Now later in Genesis 28 verse 14, this promise was transferred to Jacob. It says, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Exactly the same promise. And also we find God promising Jacob that's in Genesis 35 verse 11, that kings shall come out of thy loins. Kings, brethren, in plural, but obviously it seems not kings of one dynasty, of one line, but obviously kings of various dynasties. So therefore, we should not be surprised if all the European royal families, because you might know that several European countries are actually monarchies, like Norway, like Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, and there are a few others. I'm not sure about Liechtenstein, and I'm not sure about Luxembourg, but I think they've got some royalties, San Monaco as well. So we should not be surprised that those families may trace back their origin to Jacob and of course the house of Israel. After all, you know that northwestern part of Europe, northwestern European nations are all descendants of Israel. We'll just go over that as we go along. Of course, not to mention the British monarchy. We know that the British monarchy certainly is descendant of Jacob, and we certainly know that they are descendants of King David, direct descendants of King David. In the short lessons, we have those 12 lessons about the house of Israel. We explain that in a good detail, and I hope that I was very clearly expounding those things to you, trying to get across, brethren, how important those information are. And that all that information that we are learning and that we are discovering is actually a proof that the Word that we have, the Bible that we have, is indeed divinely inspired. Divinely inspired, and all of the books in the Bible contain so much interesting information and knowledge, which is enough for us. We don't need to be looking too much for extra biblical things, especially not. We should not be reaching into Gnostic teachings today, like the Book of Enoch and other Gnostic writings that have nothing to do with the Bible. The Bible itself contains all that we need to know, and it is very rich. It is very rich, and it's very revealing, and it just, the truth, as we get to know it, the truth simply sets us free. Now, again, so we have the promise that Jacob will have kings shall come out of his loins. And this promise was later, by the way, this promise about the kings, brethren, was later transferred to Judah by Jacob. Because Jacob, at his deathbed in Genesis 49 and verse 10, prophesied that the scepter, which is the ruling staff, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. Now margin says a lawgiver, margin says ruler's staff. So the scepter nor ruler's staff shall not depart from Judah, from between his feet. And then in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 2, it says that Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler. Now this in 1 Chronicles 5, chapter 5 verse 2, of course, does refer both to David in type and to Christ. From him came chief ruler. David was the chief ruler of all the house of Israel. And Jesus Christ, of course, as he comes, he'll be the chief ruler of all the house of Israel and of all the world. But don't forget, as it says in Romans 11, all the nations will be grafted into Israel, brethren, so therefore all the world will become Israel. All the world will become God's people. Now Christ is also the fulfillment of the promised seed that causes all the nations of the earth to be blessed by grace and salvation. So it is not surprising that we read that salvation in John chapter 4 verse 22, that salvation is of the Jews. And also in Romans 1:16, to the Jew first. Now Christ, contrary to some ludicrous statements that he wasn't a Jew, that popped up, I think, recently, in the recent perhaps 5 to 7 years. I've seen some absolutely incredible claims about him not being Jewish, even in Serbian language. They claim, of course, that he was Serbian. Could you believe that? But anyway, Christ was a Jew. Hebrews 7 verse 14, the Apostle Paul tells us that he was a Jew. And also in John chapter 4 verse 9, we see that Samaritan woman, at the well, was completely shocked that he, being a Jew, was talking to her being a Samaritan. So from Judah came, and salvation is of the Jews, not only for the Jews, but of the Jews, and to the Jew first. And Judah, if you see in Numbers chapter 10 verse 14, went first on marches. When Israel would be moving, and Judah's lot of inheritance was given first. It's written in Joshua chapter 15 verse 1. Now Judah also, brethren, had 2 more sons by his daughter-in-law Tamar. You might remember the story from Genesis chapter 38. Those 2 sons were called Phares and Zerah. Now they were racially pure Caucasians, and both could claim to be the firstborn, and consequently both established royal lines, as we did mention in those 12 short lessons. Now the proof that they were sons of Judah, and therefore royalty, lay in the signet or ring, and also in bracelets and staff of Judah that he gave to Tamar as a pledge. Genesis 38 verse 18, she asked him, to give him those things as a pledge. Interestingly enough, you'll find bracelets in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10 as well. So we have signet, ring, bracelets and staff. Now brethren, thus the British Royal Coronation Service, which uses these 3 items plus the scepter in the ceremony, testifies continually to the accuracy and truth of God's promise. Perhaps you didn't know that, the British Royal Coronation Service did include all those items, but it does. Now that was as far as the Phares is concerned, because we know that the British throne is now currently occupied by the descendants of Phares. And they know that as well, because out there, if you type out and Google out genealogy of Queen Elizabeth, you'll find exactly that information. Her genealogy goes back to Phares, then it goes back to back to King David, back to Phares, back to Judah, back all the way down to Adam. And I'm sure that the British royal family is aware of that. However, I don't know why it is not being widely publicized, perhaps because we're living in a highly secular world which despises the Bible and the Bible knowledge. But of all the people on the face of the earth, we should be aware of these things. This is part of the key of David. And at times I have to tell you, I do wish that I would have 5 minutes just to speak to Prince William or Prince Harry about their origin, just to remind them, and just to tell them that there is a group of people out there who are well aware of who they are. Now Zara, the second son of Judah, and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Zara had no children, brethren, when he went down into Egypt with his grandfather Jacob. In Genesis chapter 46 verse 12, you will find who came to Egypt. So Zara had no children, but his twin brother Phares was accompanied by his 2 sons, which are recorded in the same chapter, verse 26. Son one is called Hezron, Hezron, Z or Z-R-O-N, and Hamul, H-A-M-U-L. So Phares had 2 sons and Zara had no sons. Now the descendants of Zara, both sons and grandsons, are mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 6, 7, and 8, and in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 30 and 31. They're mentioned as the Ezrahite, basically meaning in effect Zerahite, and Heman, and Calcol, or Chalcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. It's in 1 Kings chapter 4, and this is verse 31. But brethren, the biblical genealogy of Zara, this is very important to understand, the biblical genealogy of Zara ends with this 3rd generation, indicating the departure of Zara's line from Israel while Israel was in Egypt for 400 years. Genesis chapter 15 verse 13 will tell you that. Though they departed even before the exodus of Israel. Where did they go? Where did they go? Well, the history tells us that Calcol established Zaragassa, meaning the stronghold of Zara, which is now called Saragossa, in the Ebro Valley in Spain. Ebro Valley, obviously now named after Eber, the father of the Hebrews, brethren. And Saragossa is today it's a famous Spanish town. Now in Historia Britannica, written by Camden, it states that Calcol sailed from Egypt to Spain, and from Spain to Ireland, where he established Ulat, or as we know it, Ulster, or as we know it, Northern Ireland today. Now the Irish Lepchar Gadchala, or Book of Conquests, points to these Iberi, or Iberians, from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain, also called Furbolgs, as being the earliest inhabitants of Ireland. They called the land Iberne, which was later abbreviated to Erne, then Erin, and then later Latinized to Hibernia. Those are all the names for Ireland, brethren. And even today, I think, poetically, it is still called Erin. Now realize that in pre-Exodus days, Abraham's descendants were still called Hebrews. You can find that reference in Exodus chapter 2, verse 16 and verse 13, etc. They were also called Heberites in Numbers chapter 26, verse 45. Now thus, brethren, the Hibernians, those who came from Hibernia, Hibernians or Iberi, who came to Ireland about 1700 before Christ from the Ebro River in Iberia, must be Hebrews. They must be Hebrews. They also gave their name to the Hebrides Islands and also to Eboracum, later called York, the English town of York. Now other cities in Wales and Scotland also are prefixed by the letters Aber. John Dunham Massey, one of the British writers, he states that there is evidence also that Hebrew was spoken almost all over Ireland at a very early period, as ancient inscriptions in that language have been unearthed not only on the coast but even in the very center of the country. Now Ulster, or Northern Ireland, has even to this day the heraldic symbol of a red hand circled by a scarlet cord, which of course harks back to the incident in Genesis chapter 38 verse 28, where Zara put his hand out of the womb, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, "This came out first." But then you remember he just pulled his hand back and his brother Phares came out. It's very easy to prove, brethren. All that you need to do is just Google out the flag of Ulster or Northern Ireland, and you'll see, as I said, heraldic symbol of red hand circled by a scarlet cord. Now in both Ulster and Scotland, these are the ancient and traditional official arms and heraldry. Kalkol may have also been the Egyptian Kekrops. There is a theory about that. Kekrops or Niul, N-I-U-L, who founded Athens and Thebes at the same time when Troy was founded. Now, a rampant red lion is also found on the arms of many families of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales today, brethren. And this is because Judah was likened to a lion. In Genesis 49 verse 9, his father Jacob called him a lion. And also Zara Judah would link the color red to the lion because of the scarlet thread. So the Scotch, Welsh and Irish, in that order, have varying degrees of Iberian or Zara blood. You'll find that in the writings History of England, written by George Macaulay Trevelyan, pages 32 and 33. Now, Kalkol's brother Darda, King James Version margin of 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 6, called Dardanus by Josephus. So Darda or Dardanus was the Egyptian founder of Troy, and he was also the founder of the kingdom of Priam on the southern shore of the strait called Dardanelles. Now, of course, Dardanelles, we see again the tribe of Dan and the waymark of the house of Israel on its way of migration from their new land, where they were taken by the Assyrians. They were taken around the Black Sea, and then they just made their move to northwest Europe. So anyway, the kingdom of, you see, Priam and the Troy was founded by Dardanus or Darda. Now, hundreds of years later, the city Troy was overthrown in the famous siege of Troy. There is perhaps a little bit romanticized, we might say, that movie about Troy, but nevertheless it's very educational and it's very impressive as far as I'm concerned. So what happened after the siege of Troy, brethren? After it was overturned, after which Aeneas, the last of the royal blood, took what was left of his nation and traveled with them into Europe. Now his son Brutus, on going to Malta, he was there advised to re-establish his people in the Great White Island. Now Britain was called, brethren, Great White Island because of the white cliffs of Dover. And this advice was recorded in the archaic Greek on the temple of Diana in Caia Troia, New Troy, and was later verified by the Pope. Now the king, Brutus, landed at Torbay. That was how it was called at that time, Torbay. An historic stone still stands in the town of Totnes in England, commemorating his coming. He built himself a new capital city, to which he also gave the name Caia Troia or New Troy. The Romans later called it Londinium, now known as London. And again, even in Londinium, you see in London, we have again the waymark. We have the trace of the tribe of Dan, because the tribe of Dan was like a serpent's trail. We just left all the signs on the way where the house of Israel would migrate. So there we are. Now Heman, H-E-M-A-N, brother of Niul, may have been the contemporary Egyptian Agenon who inherited Phoenicia. Mahol, M-A-H-O-L, son of Zara and the father of these famous Egyptians, was Scytha, S-C-Y-T-H-A, or Phoenicia Farsa, the Egyptian ancestor of the Milesians. You'll find it in another of the books which I have as a reference, which is Charles Adil Lewis Totten's Our Race series, volume 4, page 165. And also you can see Trojan Greek and Milesian sources, brethren, on the subject. Now the Chronicles of Ireland, they mention that the branch of Judah known as Zara colonized all the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and as far west as the British Isles and Ireland. And no wonder, as I told you, as part of the house of Israel, obviously part of the house of Judah as well, Zara's branch. They just sailed around and left the traces where they went. Others who traveled over the land, they also left the traces on the land. Perhaps the most outstanding one is the river Danube. River Danube, which basically leads us all the way up to Denmark. Now Jacob prophesied in Genesis chapter 49. Jacob prophesied for Judah. He says, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thy enemies. Now, brethren, your brethren, it says, thy brethren shall praise. It doesn't say they will persecute the Jewish people in ghettos, pogroms, or concentration camps. Now, thankfully, when you take a look at the Northwest Europe, it wasn't the instrumental in persecuting of the Jews. The instruments of the persecuting of the Jews were the Germans, the modern descendants of Assyrians. However, we have to say that some parts of Northwest Europe did, however, collaborate with Germans, in particular France, the Netherlands to a certain degree. There was one nation that was exception, a great exception was Denmark. Danish king, as far as I learned, put even the so-called David star around banded it around his arm in solidarity with his Jewish subjects. But nevertheless, the German Nazis in Denmark, I think they did commit in some way the Holocaust as well, not as much as they did elsewhere. But again, the primary author of the Holocaust were not Israelites, but were non-Israelites, Germans in particular. Now it says, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Well, that happened via King David in type. You can see that in 2 Samuel chapter 22 verse 41. In his Psalm 18 verse 40, he basically, was on the neck of his enemies, and there was a peace around his kingdom. Then the prophecy of Jacob about Judah continues, thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, they are gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion. Who shall rouse him up? In other words, like a lion. You may know that lion is also a symbol of Jerusalem, brethren. Now, what means that, Judah is peace-loving, but it's formidable when attacked. And I think their neighbors know that very well. The scepter, continues Jacob, shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver, margin, ruler's staff, from between his feet, until Shiloh come. Well, brethren, that the scepter shall not depart, and ruler's staff from between his feet, that happened tribally, was fulfilled in Numbers chapter 10, verse 14, also in Judges chapter 1, verses 2 and 10, and in the 15th chapter of Joshua. Now, personally, it was also fulfilled in the kingly line. Once 10 generations have elapsed from Judah Tamara, so from Genesis 38 until Deuteronomy 23 and verse 2, that also happened, you see, tribally. And then it says, until Shiloh come, or tribally, till he comes to Shiloh, the religious capital city, which is described in Joshua chapter 80 verse 1 in type, and personally in David and the millennial promised land in final fulfillment. So Shiloh is going to come, as it says, Shiloh among the Jewish people is the term for Messiah. And unto him, unto Judah, shall the gathering of the people be, binding his foal unto the wine, and his asses cold unto the choice wine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk, meaning plenty of wine and plenty of milk. Now, brethren, this what I've just read, the prophecy of his father Jacob, is Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12. Now, interestingly enough, the name Judah, as you see itself, actually means praise. It doesn't mean defamation, it means praise. Why? Well, because in Genesis 29, verse 35, Judah's mother, conceived again, and bore a son. And she said, Now will I praise the Eternal. Therefore she called his name Judah, and left bearing. Now, interestingly enough, that the Ulstermen, Northern Irishmen, brethren, when exported, Northern Irishmen, Ulstermen becomes an explosive commodity. Here is one remarkable fact that perhaps you people in the United States are not aware of. Of the 36 presidents of the United States, nearly 1/3 came of Ulster stock, and this from a country with a population smaller than the borough of Brooklyn. Presidents of known Ulster ancestry were Andrew Jackson, James Polk, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses Grant, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Woodrow Wilson. Perhaps the most known, at least to us here in Europe. And very well known to us in Serbia. He was a big friend of the Serbian nation, and therefore in the new part of Belgrade waterfront, a new avenue which is being built will be named after Woodrow Wilson. And a monument is also planned to be erected in his honor. He was a great friend of Serbia, and at the end of the First World War, that is, I think he was instrumental of forming of the modern Serbia within its borders, because he realized that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the losing side, and the small Serbia was on the winning side. And their history repeated itself, brethren, later in the Second World War, when the Austrians and Germans attacked little Serbia, dismembered it, occupied it, and committed another genocide. In any case, I've just named you several presidents of known Ulster ancestry, brethren, but there are other famous Americans of Ulster ancestry. Do you know that Davy Crockett was the one? Then Stonewall Jackson, Horace Greeley, Stephen Foster, for example, and a whole parcel of inventors, including Cyrus and Robert McCormick, Robert Fulton, and Samuel Morse. Morse is how do you call it in English? Morse's alphabet, or Morse is the way to communicate. In any way, you'll find this interesting information in National Geographic, August 1964, page 261. So, brethren, these men, all these men we are mentioning, have been praised. You know, their hands have been in the necks of their enemies by means of their authority, wealth, and power. Now, other people have bowed down before them because they are leaders and rulers. One of those was, for example, was President George Bush. George Bush will be the most regal president ever. It's a quote from a Seattle Times in 1988. He says, London's genealogical specialists, Burkus Peerage, say the Bush roots, which come directly from Henry III, are a great advantage. In the past, the candidate with the most royal blood has usually won, said Harold Brooks, Baker Burkus publishing director. The research found that Princess Diana is a 13th cousin 4 times removed of Bush, and Queen Elizabeth is a 13th cousin twice removed. Well, brethren, that was written in 1988 in Seattle Times. Now, the kings of Scotland, England, and most of Europe all come from these Ulster Scotch lines also. Now let us turn, brethren, to the Promised Land, where the Phares branch is still located. It says in Genesis 49 verse 10, it gives the scepter, ruler's staff, blessing to Zara and Phares. However, later in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 16, this scepter was given forever to the Phares line of David's house through Hezron, who is mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 4 verse 1, not Hamul, Hamul, who is mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 5. So to the Phares line of David's house through Hezron was given the scepter forever, and Jesus Christ was of this Phares scepter kingly line. Remember in Luke chapter 1 verse 32 it says, Gabriel said to his mother that he will come to inherit the throne of his father. When he came the first time, he didn't inherit the throne of his father, so when he comes the second time, he is going to do that, brethren. And he was also a Jew, as we read in John 4 verse 9, in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 14. Then David's throne is unconditionally, brethren, established forever. We already went over those scriptures. Let me remind you, 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 4, Jeremiah chapter 33 verses 17 through 26, Psalm 89 verses 3 and 4, and then verses 28 through 37. All those scriptures establish David's throne unconditionally forever, which means, brethren, it must exist today. Because Christ cannot come back to a non-existent throne. And even if the United Kingdom is invaded and taken captive, which it will be, as we know from the prophecy, the throne will continue somehow. Will continue. I don't know. We can speculate. It's not a doctrine, but we said we can speculate. The throne has to continue because the one who needs to occupy has to come and take it over, brethren. Not establish at his second coming. It wasn't said to his mother Mary when he'll give birth to a son, that son will come back the second time, establish the throne and sit upon the throne. No, it says that he will come and sit on the already existing throne. So the throne has to exist. Now, my speculation was one of my speculation for those who may need to have it on record. One of my speculation was perhaps, who knows, what if they make it to Jordan? Jordan is also a monarchy, by the way. What if they make it to Jordan? What if they make it to the place of safety, brethren? Remember, Jordan will be spared 3 years. Obviously for a certain reason. To help the Philadelphia remnant in the place of safety. So what if the royal family, whoever will be ruling the house or part of the royal family, with a successor, Prince William, for example, what if they come to the place of safety? We don't know. It's just a speculation, not a doctrine. My other speculation was, I keep reminding you that Queen Elizabeth is also the third cousin of the Russian Tsar. Russian Tsar Nikolai, who was murdered by the Bolsheviks, who was murdered by the communists. And therefore, since Russia will be safe haven, because Russia will be later attacked by the Germans, there will be a counterattack to sweep all the Germans. Who knows? Perhaps the British royal family, being in relation with the Russian royal family, may find refuge in Moscow, in Russia. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but the fact is, this is the fact and not a speculation, that even if the United Kingdom is invaded and taken captive, the throne will continue somehow. That's guaranteed. And there is no reason to doubt that. And there is no reason to have human reasoning, well, the nation will be taken captive, the nation will no longer exist, that therefore the throne will be non-existent. Well, then the prophecy would fail, brethren. Remember what we read about the prophecy about the throne of David. It will be overturned 3 times and no more. 3 times it will be overturned, which means that when the United Kingdom is invaded and taken captive, the throne will not be overturned. It will continue somehow, somewhere. But you see, Zara, the second son of Judah, and Tamara, Zara was not excluded from the rulership blessing. In fact, the last Davidic king mentioned in succession was Zedekiah of Judah, who was dethroned in 585 before Christ. In Jeremiah 39:6, it says also the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah. In Jeremiah 52 verse 11, we also read that Zedekiah was put in prison till the day of his death. Now King Jeconiah was excluded from the throne of David, also in Jeremiah 22 verse 24 through 30. We went through all of those verses. I'm just reminding you. Now Judah was now beginning in 585 before Christ her 7 times of national punishment, and Jeremiah was commanded to, in Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 10, to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down. And what was that referring to? It was referring to the royalty of the Phares line in Judah. But after this, it says Jeremiah 40 verse 6, went Jeremiah to Mizpah. Why to Mizpah? Because King Zedekiah's daughters were in Mizpah. Jeremiah 41 verse 10. And incidentally, the book of Esther, brethren, indicates that the Jews looked like Persians and were not of any special appearance. In Esther chapter 2 verse 10, that's where it is written. You can also find reference in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 12. So apparently Nebuchadnezzar did not know that Hebrew law permitted the princess to inherit the throne where there was no male descendants. If you go to Numbers 27 verse 8, you'll find this law that was established in Israel. So Nebuchadnezzar did not harm Zedekiah's daughters. He didn't take them to Babylon either. Now, Jeremiah 43 verse 5 to 7, the king's daughters and Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch came into the land of Egypt. And from Flinders Petrie's excavation in Egypt of the very house where Jeremiah, the princess, and the little company lived, there is a house which has retained to our time the name of the house of the Jew's daughter. So when they arrived in Taphnes, which was the Egyptian city, the Eternal warned Jeremiah that Babylon's king would soon overrun Egypt and destroy the remnant of Judah there. So Jeremiah returned into the land of Judah, Jeremiah 44 verse 28. And he was commissioned, as you see, in the first chapter of his book, as he recorded, he was commissioned to build and to plant. Now, Jeremiah 1:10, as the prophecy said, the remnant, prophecy in Isaiah 37 verse 31 and 32, the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward, for out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion. Now this remnant, brethren, was the royal daughters, which you can also see in 2 Kings 19 verse 30 and 31. And in Ezekiel 21 and verse 25, we read that the royalty would change. Why? Well, because the Eternal says, take off the crown. This crown shall not be the same. Exalt him that is low and abase him that is high. So Judah's son Phares was abased and Zara was exalted. The nation of Judah, brethren, also had been high and Israel low, as recorded in Hosea chapter 3 verse 4. So now the positions were reversed. The daughters were planted, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 17 verse 24, planted in the mountain of the height of Israel. And just as prophecy said, 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 10, I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them. So not only the tribes, brethren, that he will plant not only the tribes in Israel, not in Judah anymore, but in Israel, but also the royalty. And in the parable of Ezekiel 17, if you read that one, it is encoded so no Babylonian spy could understand. That parable describes, there are several elements, describes this whole episode. Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh were the two eagles. There was the high cedar, which is the royal house of David. The highest branch was the king Zedekiah. The tender one, or the young twigs, was the young crown princess. Now the Hebrew word there, brethren, used for tender is feminine, in contrast to the masculine form of the same word in Isaiah 53 verse 2. So to a high mountain, which was Israel, as it says in verse 23, to a high mountain that branch was taken, meaning in Ireland. And after the transplanting, this feminine twig would bring forth boughs and bear fruit and be a godly cedar, which means, brethren, that many royal descendants would come from it. And indeed, it says also under it shall dwell the fowl of every wing, meaning such nations as India, South Africa, Thailand, Malaysia, and Australia. And there are also mentioned trees of the field, which are kings, people of the world. So that was what was mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 17, and you can basically from that reconstruct how the princess continued the dynasty of David, no longer in the promised land, but now in the land of Israel, in Ireland. The throne was overturned the second time. First time it was from Jerusalem to Ireland, second time from Ireland to Scotland, third and the last time from Scotland to England, brethren, and it will not be overturned again. That's what the prophecy says. We have no reason to doubt it. Now the ancient chronicles of Ireland inform us that a Sagi, a wise man named Olam Fodla, meaning wonderful prophet, came from Egypt by way of Spain about 6 centuries before the Christian era, and that he landed on the northeast coast of Ireland where Carrickfergus is now. He brought with him a princess called Tamar Tefi, meaning the tender or palm beautiful, and a secretary scribe named Simon Brooke or Brooke. Irish poetry, brethren, and folklore identify Olam Fodla as Jeremiah and Tamar Tefi as the daughter of Zedekiah. Ancient Irish poetry is full of praise for Tamar Tefi and tells of her lofty birth, her stormy life in Jerusalem, added toughness in Egypt, her voyage to Spain, and from there to Ireland. Now, of course, on their voyage to Spain, you can guess where they stopped to make a break. As far as I remember, and I'll probably deliver you a bit more messages about those details, they stopped, I think, at Saragossa, the stronghold of Zara. Interesting enough. I think it's a port city today in Spain. And it is also claimed that Tamar Tefi's younger sister Scotta, who was with Jeremiah on the first lap of the journey, never reached Ireland due to the fact that in Spain she married a Celto-Scythian prince named Milesius. And Tamar Tefi married the Irish king called Eochaid Heremon of the Zara branch of Judah. And so, the two lines basically became united, the line of Phares and the line of Zara. They came on a ship belonging to the Iberian Danaan and brought with them a rough stone, a banner, and a large mysterious chest. On the four courts at Dublin, which is the Supreme Court of Ireland, there is a statue of the prophet Jeremiah. I think it's a small statue, and it might be inside, but anyway, there is a statue of the prophet Jeremiah. Brethren, it doesn't make sense if Jeremiah didn't reach Ireland. And it is amazing how the Irish people have, I think, have completely forgotten, completely have lost the awareness of this fact. And to this very day, you can Google it out, to this very day, Jeremiah's burial place is pointed out on a Devonish island in Ireland. You can just Google it out. And it has been known through the centuries as Jeremiah's tomb. So what's wrong with people who are just, who have been losing this precious knowledge, brethren? We have to be fired up for this truth, lest we just grow lukewarm and think that this is all not really important. Yes, it is important, because this all proves that the book we hold as the greatest, highest authority in our life is book which is true. The veracity of the Bible is being proven by these historical facts as well. It's reliable. Now, from the union of Heremon and Tea Tefi came a long line of Irish monarchs. You can all find them on, if you just Google out again, you'll find all that list there, which extended over a period of more than 1,000 years. The Scottish or Scotch monarchs were descendant from the Irish kings, as I said, and the last Scottish king, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, and from him the present Queen of Great Britain descended, brethren. And of course all of her other descendants. Now Erin or Ireland, Erin, that was the poetic expression for Ireland. Now King Heremon and Queen Tamar Tefi were crowned at Tara Hill, Hebrew Torah, upon the Ida file, or the coronation stone of Israel, just as the kings of Judah had been for centuries, brethren. It was at this time that the harp of David became part of the royal heraldic symbolism, since David was the farthest line. What is the symbol today of Ireland? It's a harp, brethren. Now why would they get harp? So you see, the heraldry also testifies about the history and identity of the modern house of Israel. Now the old prophet gave the law on Tara Hill too, and this stone of scone, or Leah file, fatal stone or stone of destiny, has a fascinating history. It was Jacob's pillow for his head when he slept. Genesis 28 verse 18, and then all the way up through verse 22, Jacob set it up, for a pillar and entered into a tithing agreement with God, brethren. And we shall stop here, and we'll continue later to see how Jacob entered into an agreement with Laban and took the same stone and set it up for a pillar. And we'll just finish next time. We shall finish this study about the tribe of Judah. A fascinating, very fascinating tribe, a tribe with a very rich history, and perhaps some of these things you might not have known, you perhaps didn't know until this time. But it's time. We are living in the last days, and all this precious knowledge needs to be restored, and it is being revealed to us by the grace of God.